That's a really good idea. Let me just run through the controls really quick so everybody knows. If you look at your screen, please, and you'll see that we started recording now. So this is part of it we probably don't really need, but I don't want to. Last time when I started the recording, it didn't actually start. So I wanted to make it sure it really started this time before we really got into the presentation. So along the top, you will see on the top left side, it says go to meeting. And then right underneath it, it says the name of the person who is talking. So you can just check in there if you want to, if you're trying to figure out who's talking. Then you can see in the very center, now on my screen right now, it says view everyone. And there's two little arrows beside that. And if you click on the little arrows, you have a choice of who you want to, how you want to see your screen. So everyone is a pretty good setting for a group this size. It's not too big. If there get to be too many people, you might want to switch to who's talking, but that will be up to you. You just go ahead and select how you want to see it. Then the next thing to the right is there's a little figure that has two little people and the number 14 beside it. And that is a list of all the people who are present. So you can just check and see who all is on there, and you will see exactly who that is. And then the next one over is a little balloon, and that is the chat button. So this is a critical button for you. The chat button is where you can put questions and comments in quietly on the side, and Alyssa is not going to be watching those, but Lolly will. So if you have questions and comments, you can be posting those into that chat. The next one's a little settings button that I hope you will not need. And the little three buttons on top of each other are some more settings I hope you don't need. But the next important thing is if you let your cursor hover over the screen, you see four buttons pop up at the bottom. One is mic, camera, screen, and leave. So the mic button and the camera button should both be green if you are if you're talking. So if you're muted, you can mute yourself there. You can also mute yourself in the top right corner of your little box. Then the screen button, Alyssa will use that one to share her screen with us, and then leave is where you'll click once we're all finished and you're ready to go. There's Karen Takamoto. I see you there, Karen. I hope you can hear us. And if you can hear us, would you unmute and say hi just to make sure that we're all on board, okay? Hi, everybody. Hey, Karen. Karen's also part of the Quaker meeting. So glad to have Quakers here. Okay, another person is popping up. Let's hold off just another second. Let's just let them get on board. Jane, if you can hear us, can you say hi and unmute and say hi so we know you can hear us okay?
Am I the only one that's hearing the static?
I do hear that static. Maybe when the rest of us all mute, it'll, that won't be in the way.
Okay.
Yeah. Jane, can you hear us okay? I hope she can hear us okay. Oh, the chat came up. Uh-oh. Oh dear. Okay. Well, Alberto, I'm sorry your battery's running low. I hope you get to see the recording later. So Jane, if you're having trouble hearing or getting your mic open, can you chat and say you're okay? And otherwise, I think, Lissa, I'm going to give you the screen now. And if you
you might have to walk me through this whole thing again about how to get full screen and all that.
Yeah, so I just made you the presenter.
Yeah, so I hit share.
So now you can hit share, and then that we should start getting your screen.
Okay, this kind of looks like what we saw. Well, not yet. Takes a minute, I think.
Lisa,
Yeah.
would you like for me to read? This is Lolly. Would you like for me to read the introduction you sent me while you're
Oh,
getting
yeah,
this figured out?
sure, sure.
That'll
But,
give you a minute of grace, won't it? Here we go. Lisa Morrison has worked in the field of horticulture for 35 plus years. She owned a wholesale plant nursery and a retail garden center, White River Nursery, in South Fayetteville. She also worked at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks for 8 years. The last 4 years there, she was a horticulture supervisor and the designer at the Botanical Gardens. Since retiring 2 years ago, Lisa has dedicated her time and energy to educating and increasing the knowledge and use of native plants. She's currently involved with the Arkansas Native Plant Society Education Committee. She's the vice president of the Wild Ones Ozark chapter, and when she has time, she's a consultant for landscaping with native plants. And just a reminder, if you have a question for Lisa, if you'll put it in the chat, I'll make sure she gets the question when she decides it's time for questions. Thank you.
And Lisa, I did not get everybody muted before we started, so I'm going to mute everybody, then you unmute yourself.
I'm not.
Okay,
Okay.
unmute yourself then. Okay.
Okay. All right, but Gladys, the PowerPoint's not pulling up. I hit share screen and it didn't happen. It says people can see my screen, but I assume they're seeing what I see, which is pretty much the GoToMeeting front page.
That's not helpful.
No.
Well, okay, you're supposed to be the presenter. So I'm supposed to
Try hovering over your shared screen icon and see if it shows up other choices.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Hover over the shared screen and that might open up some windows of your other screens. And then you pick the one.
Let's see.
PowerPoint icon is at the bottom.
Too many people are talking to me at one time. So I'm hovering over the thing that says stop sharing screen.
Okay,
It also
no,
says
not
the webcam. All right, something's happening here. Share my webcam. Hang on. Should I
try
click on it?
Try it.
A lot of static, nothing. Maybe I should, a tip my kids have given me, I should go away and rejoin the meeting, Gladys, and see what happens. How about that?
Okay. All right.
Okay, so I'm going
Before you,
Wait.
Lisa,
Yeah.
before you do that,
Yeah.
on your screen, I can see you've got the little orange round circle that I think it has a P for PowerPoint.
Down to
It's
the
very bottom.
Yeah. Click on that.
Click on that.
Ah,
Oh, yeah. Click or double click, something.
yay. Somebody, who was that who told me how to do that? Thank you very much. Okay, so.
Okay, everybody,
From the beginning.
please mute yourselves now that we've got that taken care of.
Yeah. Well, so thank you, Molly and Gladys. And as you can all tell, this is new to many of us. And this is, even though I have given many presentations over the years, this is the first virtual presentation. So thank you ahead of time for bearing with me, because this is new to me, as you just saw, how to get the first thing going. So let's get going here. And for There was suggesting reading for this, and it was Doug Tallamay's book called Bringing Nature Home. Now, I'm going to assume that almost everybody watching this has not read this book. I know Lolly is in the middle of reading it, but it is an excellent book, and if you hadn't read it, I suggest it's good reading. It's interesting, and I hope that by the end of this PowerPoint, you will be inspired to maybe read it if you haven't. He and I have the same. He is an entomologist, and he comes at it from a totally different angle. I'm a landscaper and a horticulturist, and so I come at it from that angle. So let's, one of the things that what Doug said in his quote was that all of life is dependent on plants. So I want to just look at this simple food web here for a minute and just focus on what we're talking about here when we say that life is dependent on plants. Insects are very important. I'm going to see the insects here. And this is a very simplified version of the food web. I hope I'm not insulting anyone's intelligence. But the point I like for people to keep in mind as we move along is that plants are at the bottom of the food web. And all of the things that we love and treasure and need that are higher up on the food web are dependent on plants. Unfortunately, things have gotten a little bit out of balance, and many of the higher life forms on the food web are in decline. Butterflies are down approximately 50%, and birds are down around 30%. Now, when I say these numbers, that means all butterflies across the board, because most of us already know that monarchs are down more than 50%. But if you group them all together, then the butterflies are down around 50%. Pollinator insects are down 41%. Amphibians, unfortunately, my screen is covered a little bit because of what the sidebar over here. I'm going to say it's around 40%. That's what my memory says. But actually, this whole thing about the percentages, I've read many, many different articles and had lots of discussions with people. And there is controversy about these percentages of numbers, about whether or not they are inflammatory or too high and possibly inflated for inflammatory purposes. Well, I really don't like getting hung up on whether or not it's 50%. The lowest I've seen on butterflies as a group is that they are down about 30. The lowest number I've seen is 35%. My point is that regardless of what you think about the percentages, no one is arguing about whether or not there are declines. There are declines across the board for insects around the world, and many of the other creatures, turtles, frogs, all kinds of the creatures that are higher up on the food web are in decline. So again, I don't want to bog down in the actual numbers, but there is broad agreement in science that there are declines. And that's like the canary in the coal mine, something we need to pay attention to. So there are several reasons for this decline. One of the main ones is loss of habitat. Humans have moved into across our continent. We're going to focus on North America and not the entire planet, though that's not a bad idea. But across our continent, we have moved into what used to be natural habitat. Fragmented habitat is part of this problem, or degraded habitat. It all is part of the same problem, which means that we've moved cities and towns and suburbs, or agribusiness, where when you think about the Corn Belt, used to be prairie, and now there is only 1% of the prairie left. So that's when we have cities and towns, and then we have agribusiness in the countrysides. we have broken up what used to be a continuous flow of healthy natural habitat. Obviously, pesticides are one of the reasons we're having decline. Pesticides are made to kill off what is called pests, but pesticides kill insects. They kill other creatures too. And the critters that eat the insects are often made sick or weakened by the pesticides. Competition from invasive species, the best one, and everyone knows about kudzu. It's pretty obvious when the invasive species of kudzu moves in, that it takes over and it kills off the native vegetarian. It kills off all, kudzu kills off all vegetation. So that's just an extreme example of what invasive species does. One that most of us relate to, if you're familiar with Fayetteville at all, and I would say probably every town in Northwest Arkansas, is the, I've gone blank, we all know it, the bush honeysuckle and privet. Those, there you go. They tend to be taking over our towns. So what happens is these invasive species, Bradford pear is another well-known one, they crowd out the native fauna and flora. So of course, air pollution, water pollution, and light pollution are all part of why we're seeing these declines. Light pollution is an interesting one, and Doug talks about this quite a bit because he's an entomologist, and that means he is very concerned about the night insects that go out to find their food at night, but they are so confused by all the lights that they cannot find their food. And then, of course, there is climate change, which can potentially cause rapid loss of many species. Now, some of the species will adjust and some will not. And we are, you know, of course, we will see some that go completely extinct. But I think of biodiversity and climate change as going hand in hand. And we'll talk more about that as I go along. I like to show this slide because it shows what I mean by habitat being taken over. Us humans have taken over the habitat that used to be natural, complete, and continuous. And as I point now, Arkansas, we are, let me see if I can get my, yeah, we are about right here, more or less. And this is more or less the Corn Belt, which used to be prairie. And corn, when I say Corn Belt, I just mean the giant place, agribusiness, where we grow so much of the necessary food, we cannot ignore that. But this has changed our focus on what is naturally in these areas. So, when I talk about urban density, there are 87% of them, or 84%, I'm not sure which, but somewhere in there, live in urban settings. And so we've created these cities and towns and suburbs, and then in the places out of the towns, we often have these large monoculture farms, like the slide I showed you where you could not see a weed or a flower blooming. And so it has taken away the food and fragmented what used to be a continuous flow of good habitat. So this is a typical landscape, and you know, that could be found in almost any town or suburb in the eastern US. It doesn't look like the West because it looks pretty lush. So you think and say, well, there are plants everywhere, there are trees everywhere. What is the problem? The problem is that just because there are plants, the insects and the critters that we need that are higher up on the food chain may not necessarily be finding the food they need. And this is part of what I want to talk about, is that for years, around 400 years, ever since the settlers came across the ocean and we brought these plants from other countries, and use them to decorate our homes, we have gotten where most of what we use in our landscapes and towns and cities is non-native plants. We have mostly ignored the native plants to beautify our landscapes and our businesses and our towns. Unfortunately, the critters that are dependent on the ecosystem cannot use most of these plants. And I'm going to explain to you why not. So we could look at this and we could see lots of plants, but as far as the creatures that we're trying to help with their fragility and their decline, that might be an ecological desert. It just, we'll get into the depths of why that is so in a minute. So it brings us back to another basic looking food web, but again, all of these creatures are dependent on plants, including humans. There have been, people have really not been paying much attention to this for but maybe 50 years. And then there's been quite a bit of research that's been going on in the last 30 years. Doug Tallamy is one of the most well-known researchers that is paying attention to some of these things. Now this is over here, these statistics here are about a study that he and excuse me, some of his college students, he teaches at the University of Delaware as an entomologist, and he has lots of people under him that are doing doctorates and master's theses. And this was a 3-year study at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And it was, what they came up with is that in yards that had native plants, there were 3 times more butterflies, twice as many native birds, and 50% more twice as many native bees, and 50% more native birds and other animals. Excuse me, let me get something to drink here. So, according to what I hope you're understanding, it's the native plants that are the foundation of a healthy ecosystem. It doesn't do any good, and it's part of the reason we're having declines when we have nothing but non-natives available, which is the case in most cities and towns. When you go to a garden center, 95% of what is sold, and I used to own a garden center and I'm guilty of this too, 95% of what was sold or is sold is non-native plants. The best way for me to explain why that is a big deal is talking about the monarch, because most people do understand that the monarch cannot feed, its caterpillars cannot feed on anything but milkweeds. And there are several different kinds of milkweeds, but that is the only plant that the monarch caterpillar can eat. And so that is called a specialist relationship. Another good example of that is the swallowtail, the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. Its caterpillars can only feed on 2 plants. One is the spicebush. It's a shrub called the spicebush, and the other is the sassafras tree. So the spicebush can only, the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar can only feed on 2 plants. 90% of all insects have this specialized relationship with plants, which means and it's only 1, 2, or 3 plants for the most part. They can't feed on just any plant in the yard. It has to be the specific certain plant that they have a specialized relationship with, that they have developed over thousands of years. Another example is this exquisite zebra swallowtail. The only plant its caterpillars can feed on is the pawpaw tree. And what that means, if they can't find if that caterpillar, that butterfly goes to lay the egg, and this egg is going to be laid on a pawpaw tree, and then when it hatches into a caterpillar, if it's not a pawpaw tree, then that caterpillar will die and the life cycle is not completed. So 90% of insects have to have 1, 2, or 3 plants or their life cycle will not be completed. And that makes perfect sense why there's so many declines in so many numbers. The insects are hugely important in the food web. They're almost as important as plants because so many things feed on insects. But of course, the insects feed on plants. So plants are still number one, but the insects, if the insects that are declining, we're going to just see many declines all across the board up and down the food web. So if most insects they cannot find their 1 or 2 plants that they need for their reproduction, then we will continue to see the declines. Let's see, at some point I want to take a break. Not quite yet. So there are other benefits. There are many benefits to native plants, but the main one is that it props up the food web. It is necessary. I say that it is necessary for food, and the reason I say native plants are necessary for food is because 1/3 of everything we eat is dependent on pollinators. And so the pollinators are going to be declining unless they can find the food they need to eat. And so that's why I say that native plants are necessary for food. Native plants, it will also be of benefit that less water will be used because native plants have been around for thousands of years and they've already adjusted to our wild swings of weather, including drought. So they don't use as much water. They stabilize the soil. One of the main reasons they stabilize the soil is because a lot of the native plants have such deep roots. There is no need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. You know, chemicals have only been around since approximately World War II. I know they were around before that, but they began to be used in higher amounts about that time. And then we went through a phase where we used quite a bit. And these plants have been around, native plants have been around since before the time of our country being settled by Europeans. And they didn't even know what fertilizers and chemicals were. So they are used to, they have evolved, and they know how to get along with the bugs and all with no chemicals and no pesticides. So they are much tougher. They've been around for a long time. This is a good slide that shows the difference in non-native, the depth of the roots. I want you to note it. Now, these are all non-natives over here, typical plants that we see in yards, and some of them are very beautiful. The spirea, daylilies, fountain grass, most of us know what that is. I find the most interesting one, and I learned this when I found this slide. This is 15 feet deep for a 9-bark. I don't know if everybody is really sure what a 9-bark is, but there are many burgundy colored ones sold in garden centers all over the place. You rarely see the native species 9-bark that is green being sold in a garden center. But you can see that all these deep roots would be better at stabilizing soil. And then the other thing is it's sequestering carbon with these deep roots. So this is what you would call good ecological services. There are many ecological services that native plants provide, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But carbon sequestration is one. I mean, I think a lot of people think only about trees as being able to sequester carbon, but deep roots or roots also do, but the deeper the better. So let's talk about ecological services. Now, I apologize, this is a little bit fuzzy, some of this small print, but there are lots of programs all over the United States that are tree planting programs, and I think they're wonderful. I think that's great because trees as a group of plants provide, this is this circle of services is about 12 or 14. I'd have to count, but I'll just read a few of them. It reduces evaporation rates, habitat for birds and insects, provides shade, beauty, acts as windbreaks, slows down water runoff. These are all things that all trees do. Provide food for the bees, the birds, and other animals, stops erosion, timber, oxygen, provides firewood, and one of the biggest one is that it uses or sequesters carbon dioxide and helps reduce global warming. I see, so all trees do all of these things, but only native trees do the one of propping up the food web. And so I see it as a missed opportunity when we are not using more native trees in our landscapes and in our urban regulations, when we are not insisting on or encouraging, at least. I know Americans don't like laws and rules, so we would not want to tell anybody they had to use native plants. But I would like to make the suggestion that we use more native trees in these programs where we are adding trees, which is a wonderful thing to do. So here's why, to get specific, this matters to me. In a typical landscape, what I've shown you here is two trees. They're both shade trees. They're both attractive. They particularly have that fall color of yellow, which when I owned a garden center, people were often, when they wanted to buy a tree, the fall color was real important to them. Everybody loves the fall colors. So, you know, I'm showing you here two trees that show that both have yellow fall color. But let's talk about this shagbark hickory that is a native tree, and it supports approximately 200 different kinds of insects. This ginkgo tree that is not native supports 0 insects. So this is the tree. Native trees, as a rule, support the food web, whereas non-native trees do not in terms of ecosystem services, particularly where the food web is concerned. So landscaping with native plants, I hope, is what you are understanding. Not just any plant, but native plants is the key to bringing back balance. As we've talked about, it supports the food web, which is going to increase the number, higher life forms. It increases those numbers, which means we have more pollinators and more birds and bees, more amphibians, more of those cute creatures, more, what was it I saw today? It wasn't a squirrel, a chipmunk, cute little chipmunk family out where I live. All those things are supported when you start off with native plants as the basis of the food web. And add to that, of course, that it helps mitigate climate change. So I want to check in with Lolly and see if there are any questions at this point, Lolly. This would be a good time to take a pause and see.
No questions yet, Lisa.
Okay, I've just had
Unless someone wants to address questions to you.
Yeah, does anybody want to ask a question right now? We'll take a little break before we go any further. Or you can, you know, save it for the end. Okay, well, I hope I'm not putting you to sleep and that's why there are no questions. Okay, we're going to keep going if there are none. Okay, one of the questions I had people ask a lot when I give talks is, what percentage of native plants do I need to have in my yard to make a difference? According to a study that, now this is an article that Doug wrote. If you want to read the whole article, it's very interesting. That it tells about this study that was a 3-year study with Carolina chickadees. And what they found out is that after, when they were in the yards, and it was several yards, it's a very interesting study, when they were in yards that had less than 70% native plants, the number of chickadees began to decline. The number, they counted the babies, they counted how many of the babies lived, how many eggs, they counted all kinds of things. And what they found is a decline after 70%. Now, that does not mean that if you have 100 plants in your yard, that 70 of them need to be native plants. What it does mean, you need to think biomass. In other words, if you have native trees, which carry the weight of much more biomass than, say, an echinacea, which is a very valuable native plant, purple coneflower, then that is what we need to think about when we say 70%. It does not necessarily mean 70 out of 100 plants. So why did they see decline when the birds did not have 70% biomass in the particular yard? Well, how about this number? This is amazing to me, that for one mom and dad chickadee to raise 5 babies, it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. Where in the world are they going to find that many caterpillars for 5 babies? If they don't have a lot of native trees with a lot of caterpillars, their babies are either not going to thrive, they're going to be weak, or they're just plain going to die. And that's part of the reason we are having declines in our bird numbers. So if biodiversity and climate change go hand in hand, then what are some of the things that we as individuals can do to make a difference? And this is one of the main things, as I said earlier, Doug focuses on bugs because he's an entomologist, and I focus on landscapes because that's what my background has been. So what I try to encourage people to do is change things, particularly in urban settings where even though we see lots of plants, it can be ecological desert if there are no native plants in that yard. Now, if I know several of the people that are here live in the woods, and so this may not matter to you. You are in the woods, and the balance of the woods in Ozarks is not bad off. We can talk about that some towards the end if you're interested in the why behind that. The main reason is because the woods, for the most part, are full of native trees. And native trees have a huge ecological footprint, whereas native perennials don't have quite as big a footprint. But these are some things we can do that would make a difference. Create pollinator gardens or rain gardens or butterfly gardens. And in the process, hopefully you are having less grass. Lawn. Lawn is ecologically non-productive. I think about it doesn't have deep roots. It doesn't slow down runoff that much. I think it services the chiggers and maybe the grasshoppers, and that is not good enough for me. But I'm not against lawn. I mean, grass, and having a bit of grass or part of your yard being grass is a good thing, and I can understand why, especially with children, grass is important. If you have some non-productive trees or shrubs in your yard now, by that I mean, say you have this tree that's been bugging you forever because it's outgrown its space, it's too big, it's not native. How about getting rid of it and replacing it with a native shrub or tree? Plant more host plants. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. When we talk about pollinate, there are 2 things to pay attention to: the pollinator plants and the host plants. And a lot of articles and attention is being given to pollinators and pollinator gardens for good reason, because the pollinators are in decline, and that all makes sense. And it's wonderful that people are creating pollinator gardens, but pollen is what pollinator gardens are, and it's what the insects use for energy, for calories. It is a form of their food, but it is, if they do not have the host plant, which is the plant they need to reproduce to complete their life cycle, it does no good to have pollinator plants if they cannot complete their life cycle. So the host plants are, the more host plants we can get in our yards and suburban settings, the better. We're going to talk about invasive plants a little bit in a couple of slides. And of course, stop using pesticides. We're also going to talk about that in a couple more slides. I took this shot when I was walking around with my daughter Sophie in Fayetteville one day, and I was so impressed. This was a typical subdivision yard. This shot here makes the yard look a lot bigger than it is. It's probably a typical classic quarter acre. It's not very big. The front yard, they had, this is the street. Let's see if I can make this. This is the street right here. And they had created a bed in here, and they hadn't planted it all yet. And this, I think the angle of my camera made it look bigger than it is. It's only about 6 feet deep. And this is where you come into the side of the driveway. But when you look, this is what their grass is like now. So they shrunk their lawn. And that's what I mean by creating beds and having less grass and more ecologically productive plants in our landscapes. So let's talk about invasive plants for a minute. This is maiden grass. It is the most widely sold native ornamental grass in the landscape garden center industry. It's beautiful. You see it all over Fayetteville, but there are many choices of native grasses that will help prop up the food web where maiden grass does not. The other thing is that maiden grass has been declared invasive in 27 different states. It has not been declared that in Arkansas yet, but I'm going to predict it's just a matter of time. So we need to stop buying and planting these plants. If you have one and you have the energy or the wherewithal to dig it up and replace it with native plants, that would be a good thing. But this is some more source material if you're interested in the invasive plants. This next slide, this is part of an ordinance. I'm proud of Fayetteville. I feel like they are making an effort at creating invasive plant lists. Now, this does not apply to homeowners. This only applies to landscape projects that have to be reviewed by the landscape board, a city board. And these are several of the this is the list of, they are not allowed to use this if this is a reviewed project. Unfortunately, many of these are still being sold in garden centers. English ivy, this is also called purple leaf winter creeper, takes over trees and kills them. Many of these are still being sold, and money is what makes the difference. If the people who grow, the large nursery companies that grow these plants, if they quit selling them and quit making money, they'll quit growing them. So we've got a ways to go, but I say we stop buying these things. So I mentioned landscaping with host plants. Now this is why it really matters, talking about whether or not a plant has ecological services and just how productive is it. I've mentioned several times that trees are incredibly productive. They have a large footprint in a positive way. Oak trees support around 500 different kinds of insects. And cherry trees, it's around 400. I can't read my own PowerPoint here. Maples are around 200. So you see, and there is a list, a place you can go to find how many insects, and it's per county, which is amazing that people are estimating how many insects are supported by our native trees. Whereas non-native trees like the ginkgo support 0. When you talk, now this is just the top 3 trees. It may be the top 4, but I left out the 3rd one because I think it was willows. And it's important that you pay attention if you decide to go use more natives, which willow, or which maple, because Norway maple is from Norway, it's not native. So I'll tell you in a little while how you figure that out. There are many willows being sold as plants to use in landscape, and most of them are not native. The willows that are native are not particularly well behaved and attractive for landscapes. You see them around farm ponds, and they are very valuable, but they are not what I call well behaved. so when you look at herbaceous perennials, these are the top 3 supporters, or the most productive of the herbaceous perennials that are native. Goldenrod is huge. How many insects? If you are wanting to plant more perennials and not trees, then every yard needs goldenrod in it because of, and we'll talk about that goldenrod specifically in a minute. Asters are very important because not only do they support 112 different kinds of insects, mostly I'm talking butterflies and moths, but they also are blooming very late in the season when many of our birds and insects are migrating. Our butterflies, many of the butterflies migrate, and they need food and energy. They need pollen and nectar to have the energy to migrate, and asters are one of the latest blooming flowers. So not only do they support a lot of insects, but they also have an ecological service that's hard to get otherwise. This is an interesting fact about hummingbirds. I like to talk about this, and I meant to mention this when we were looking at the chickadee, is that our hummingbirds and chickadees cannot eat what we feed. They cannot raise their babies on what we feed them in our backyards. That chickadee cannot feed black oil sunflower seeds to their babies. They have to feed, they need high quality protein. They need soft protein to cram it down the throat of their babies. I don't know if you've ever seen any video of that. It's pretty interesting. But they can't live, they can't raise their babies on our sunflower seeds from our bird feeders. Hummingbirds cannot feed their babies the hummingbird nectar that we put out. That is not possible for them to raise babies on that. In fact, even though we do put out the hummingbird feeders, you need to understand that that's for the humans, because 80% of what a hummingbird eats is insects and spiders. This is what they raise their babies on, and they can't live themselves as adults or as babies without 80% insects and spiders. Also, hummingbirds use the spider webs to make their nest, and that's part of what they use. They use other things also. But so you see how interconnected it all is, and how dependent our creatures that are higher on the food web are on the plants and then the insects that are both support life. So I like to show this shot because it is a picture that I took when I worked at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks. And we stopped using, the last 4 years I was there, we didn't use many in the first place, but we decided we were not going to use any more toxic chemicals. And when you go to this garden, and I hope everybody listening has been, if you haven't, I encourage you to. When you walk in, what you see is beauty. You don't walk in and see defoliated, chewed up leaves, though that if you look, you'll find that, because there is a huge diversity of plants and flowers and insects and trees there, and it has achieved a very nice balance. The good bugs eat the bad bugs, and it is working out quite well. There are some issues, but if you decide you cannot, and I'm not encouraging anyone to let the tomato hornworms have the tomatoes instead of you. A vegetable garden is a different category, but if you are going to use any kind of pesticide, hopefully it's organic and it's very targeted to the insect that you are trying to stop. I understand the white cabbage moth will decimate your cabbages, but there are organic remedies, and we could have a whole PowerPoint just on that. So, but try to use organic. And again, I like to show people that you do not have to use chemicals to have a beautiful garden. We do need to get used to seeing a few more bug holes, and we need to think of that as a good thing, because we are supporting life when there's, now we're not talking about Japanese beetles, that's a different thing. That's totally different. So I want to talk about some practical tips for landscaping with native plants, because I think part of the problem is that even though these plants have been around for thousands of years, we are not used to these plants. This is not what we have been seeing in our garden centers. And so we're not familiar with how tall, how bushy, how the growth habit, or where they grow for that matter. So there is a learning curve when you are working with native plants and you decide to put more native plants in your yard. Most people, most Americans are not ready to have their yards look like a meadow or the ditch along the side of the highway. And many people live in subdivisions where there are rules against such things. So I have been paying attention to which native plants are what I call well-behaved for almost 20 years. And anytime I learned or read about or experimented with a plant and decided that it is what I call well-behaved, I wrote it down. And so a few years back, I put it into a list, and I constantly change this list and update it. It's called Well-Behaved Natives. If you are interested, you can go to the Botanical Garden of the Ozark website. This is the web address right here. And click on the Learn tab. And then there's a section about native plants. There aren't that many choices. You can poke around and find. It's in a PDF form, which means printable, and it's about 9 or 10 pages. I used to hand it out when I gave talks, but it got way too expensive. And also, I upgraded all the time. Also, I was using way too much paper, all that printing. But if you want to print it out for yourself, it is a good place to begin so that you are making choices that are educated. Now, a lot of people ask me, do you mulch native plants? You can. If you want to have a tidier garden, you certainly can mulch. I encourage people to use leaf mulch because so many insects complete their life cycle in leaves. Now, I'm not talking about leaves that have been chewed up by the lawnmower. When you chew your leaves up, you are often chewing up part of a life cycle of some insect. I think it's the next slide. You'll see what I mean. So whole leaves, I hesitate to tell people this, but in the fall when all those leaves, I understand if you don't want to have leaves at your front door and you want your front yard to be raked and tidier looking, but try to leave some spaces in your yards or in your flower beds where you have leaf mulch. Prune and shape native plants and shrub. All of the native plants, shrubs and trees and perennials can be pruned and shaped just like any plant you buy from the garden center. The same principles apply. You will have to look up and find out when does it bloom. The more research you do, the better success and the happier you will be with your plants. Now we're going to talk a little in depth about cutting back the spent perennials after the flowers fade, because when at least 5 years ago, there was many articles written about not cutting down your perennials or your nectar plants or your seed heads of coneflowers because the birds eat them. Well, after an echinacea blooms, if most people are familiar with the echinacea purple coneflower, after they bloom, the leaves get brown and scruffy and they don't look so good. And you can cut that back to the ground and it will sometimes rebloom. You don't have to look at that ugly leaves and brownness if you don't want to. Cut it back. The thing about cutting off the food for the birds, if you want to save those coneflower heads for the birds, you can do that. Be creative. One of the things we did at the Botanical Gardens, where we did not want our gardens to look messy and unkempt, was to make arrangements with this somewhat, at this point, they look almost dried, seed heads in heavy ceramic pots, or it doesn't even have to be heavy, just a pot that you put a heavy rock in. You don't want it to blow over, and you make somewhat of a dried arrangement. It could be a mix, it can be just purple coneflowers, but you use those seed heads, and the birds will still use those seed heads for food if they are upright. The first time I did this, I hung it kind of like you do herbs upside down, and none of the birds came. I learned. So hanging them, setting them upright so that the birds they don't know the difference that it's been cut off. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by well-behaved. In Arkansas or in the Ozarks, there are approximately 27 different kinds of native goldenrod. I only know of 3 that are what I call well-behaved. The rest of them you see as you travel along the highways. They're tall, they spread like crazy, but because I've been paying attention, now these 3 are on that list called well-behaved natives. So that's what I mean by, don't just go to a garden center and say, I want a goldenrod. Go to the garden center, and after you've done a little research, and get a goldenrod that has a tidier look for a landscape setting. Again, goldenrod is worth having in every single yard because they are so ecologically productive. They support so many butterflies and moths. They are top of the list for herbaceous perennials. So it'd be nice if everybody had this in every neighborhood. We would have more butterflies, more birds, more reptiles. We would have more of all of it. Milkweed's real important because everybody wants to put milkweed in their yard now, but just help save the monarch butterflies, and that's wonderful that is happening. There are several, maybe a dozen or so different species of milkweed that are native to Arkansas, but these are the ones that I have on my list that I think are well behaved. And so just pay attention to the growth habit and of the plant that you pick. Now, this is a great milkweed because it gets really big. The leaves are really big, which means it has a lot of food for those caterpillars. But if you put this in anywhere near a flower bed, you will regret it. It pops up everywhere. It gets 6 feet tall. It's floppy. It's beautiful for the wilder places. It's great if you have the space, but it is not one you want to put in a flower bed or a more manicured spot. Now, this is what I'm talking about, leaving the leaves. Luna moths lay their eggs up in the trees, and then when the leaves fall, those cocoons, a moth is called a cocoon, a butterfly is called a chrysalis, but the cocoon of the Luna moth is on those leaves, and if you chew them up, you're chewing up Luna moths. If you've never seen a Luna moth, it's a treat because they're beautiful and they're big. Most of us have because one of their main host plants is oak trees, and we do have lots of oak trees in the Ozarks. So many people have seen this. While I'm here, I want to tell you, if this is a great resource, if you're not, it's pronounced Xerces. Xerces is the name of the first North American butterfly that went extinct. And this society was formed, it's called the Xerces Society, was formed several years ago. And so it is full of good information about using native plants and creating native gardens. But if you can save these leaves and use them in your flower beds, that will help specifically the Luna moths, but there are many, many other insects that overwinter in the leaves. I am getting feedback. It looks like M is not muted, and I am getting, it's like I'm listening to somebody else's conversation. Is everyone muted but me? That would be nice. I'm not sure who M is. Oh, that's Melancy. Melancy, will you mute? I'm not sure it's you, but I sure am hearing more noise than makes it easy.
It started to rain here.
But go ahead and mute your, put it on mute, and then maybe that'll block out some of the noise.
Well, I just turned it on 5 seconds ago. It was off all the time.
Okay, well, let's see if we'll keep going, and everybody try to please mute, and we'll see if that helps. I'm hearing a conversation. I don't know who it is. Okay, let's talk about pruning and shaping. Most people who live in the Ozarks have now discovered the beautiful serviceberry trees. They're one of the first things to bloom, which means It gives nectar to the pollinators early in the season before it, while everything else is still brown. These are blooming. This is what they kind of look like in the wild. That's a fairly young tree, but you know, you can see that all the branches have been left. But this is a serviceberry also. This is just to show you that if you want to shape and prune your trees, you can. Same rules apply for pruning. Again, we could have a whole class on nothing but pruning, but the same rules apply. And the number one thing, trees in general get pruned when they're dormant. Now that's as far as I'm gonna go on that because we could talk way too long. This is another example, deciduous holly. This is the one you see when you're driving down the highway in the wintertime, and it's a tree that doesn't have any leaves, but it's covered in red berries, and you see it along the fence rows, and it's called deciduous holly. And this is typical of what it looks like. Of course, they're bigger along the fence rows, but you can leave it wild like that, and that shape if it fits into your yard and your landscape, or it can be pruned and shaped and limbed up. That's what I call it, where you cut the bottom limbs off and give it that. You can do that if you want to, and it gives it a more manicured look. Now, back to the cutting back perennials. There are two things to talk about for cutting back perennials. One is whether or not to leave your perennials when they look ratty. Many perennials will bloom again if you cut them right after they bloom and the blooms go kind of ugly looking. If you cut that off to the ground even, the foliage will come again before the frost. The other time people talk about whether or not to cut back is when it's fall and it's going into winter. And many of the native gardens I've seen, particularly rain gardens, you know, things are 4 feet to 10 feet tall and everything's brown and it's really messy looking. I have been on walks with people where I've had them say, I don't want that in my yard. I don't want it to look like that. Well, research has been done that shows that the insects overwinter in the bottom 14 inches. So if you have a bed or a front yard or someplace that you want to be tidier, and you've planted native plants, if you cut the brown ugliness down to 14 inches, you are still saving the insects. Many insects overwinter in the hollow stems of native plants. And so that is the reason that there were so many articles written several years ago about not cutting them back, because we were killing the overwintering insects. But now we know that we can cut them back to 14 inches. And if you get to leave them, great. And then you go out in the spring and you clean up. But if you don't want to look at that, you don't have to. This is an example of a dried arrangement. Now, this isn't a very big planter, but you can do any size you want and put that somewhere in your garden as yard art. And it's attractive. It looks like it belongs there, and the birds will still eat on it. And the insects, the birds and insects. So this is at the Botanical Gardens out in the parking lot. We did an experiment one year where this is, I'm trying to remember, it's one of the Rudbeckias. Now these two were side by side in these two plantings, and one at the end of the school year, the end of May, the late spring, it was about 4 feet tall, and we cut it to 2 feet. This one we didn't cut at all. And so when these started to bloom in August, they're blooming now. This one was very floppy. This one 2 weeks later bloomed just as much as this one. I should have taken the picture 2 weeks later. I'm sure I got too busy. But it was standing up like this. And so it will delay your blooms a little bit when you do that. Now this applies to only late summer blooming, fall blooming perennials. If you don't want the taller look, or if you want your plant to be shorter, stouter, bushier, and maybe not lean over into your sidewalk or whatever, if you prune it at the end of May, you'll get more of this upright look and less of the flop. And that applies to any perennial, native perennial that blooms summer or fall, late summer or fall. I like to show this slide because, again, this is at the Botanical Gardens. It's the front of the garden that's called the Native Garden. It's mulched, it's tidy, it is 100% native. Fringe trees are wonderful. They're just exquisite, and they are beginning to be sold in various native plant sales and from some of the nurseries. This is Monarda or Bee Balm. This is Golden Alexander. I think that one's Baptisia, or I can't remember. The blue indigo is the common name, and I think this one is, nope, I'm not sure what that one. Maybe that's no, that's Monarda. I'm not sure what that one is. But I like to show people that, again, you can have a pretty, native plants can be beautiful. Native gardens can be beautiful. They can be as manicured or as not manicured as you want. That is up to you. This is a handy thing to know and pay attention to. This is, I'm gonna have to do a little education here to help people understand what this is. First of all, this is the genus word, and this is the species word, and this is the common name, Southern Magnolia. If you want to find out if a plant is native or not, now there are many magnolias sold in garden centers, and some of them are native and some of them are not. So say you go, and the two examples I'm going to give is, there's one called Star Magnolia, and the white flower looks kind of like a star. It's beautiful, but it is not native. If you want to find out if and you don't know, you could just, well, this map is very useful to know about. So you type in the genus word, Magnolia is the genus, and then this word BONAP, that stands for Biota of North American Project. Plants are being counted all over the continent, which is wonderful, and they really have learned amazing things. But there will be a color key, and you'll be able to learn so much. Play around with this and go look at this with different genuses. You could look up Oaks quercus, you could look up Echinaceas, and almost every species is listed, which is amazing. So from this, you will need to understand the color key, but what this shows us here is this is the native range that a Southern Magnolia would grow. This is the bright green is where it is truly native, and it has a specialized relationship with the ecosystem in that part of the country. This teal green means it has become naturalized. It didn't start off here like this, but it has gotten so prolific that they now call it naturalized. It is not a non-native, but what we're not sure of is whether or not when it's naturalized like this, we don't know yet how much ecosystem services, how much of a special relationship with insects does it have. It may not support anything. One example is I planted a plant that is native in Florida, and I see almost no insects on it. I mean, it's native to Florida. It is not native to Northwest Arkansas. So you don't have to be rigid about it, but this is a good place to go and learn all kinds of things about a plant if you are not sure whether it's native or not. For those of you who want to dive deeper into this and do the research on native plants. So this is the summary here. I have no idea how long that took me. I usually lose track of time. These are the things that I hope that, number one, that you may get interested enough that you go read Doug Tallamy's book. I don't think I used the word. If I did, keystone plant, that is those plants like the oak trees or the goldenrod that are so valuable as far as the native ecology goes and propping up the food web that they provide a ton of services and on many different levels. And so I've only talked about a few, but if you Google something like native keystone plants for Northwest Arkansas or the Ozark region, then you will come up with real interesting and more specific plants. All of those keystone plants are going to be on my well-behaved natives list. Again, I hope you understand why it's important to not just focus on the pollinator plants, but also on the host plants, because if those insects cannot find their 1, 2, or 3 plants that they need to complete their life cycle, then they will not complete their life cycle. This is all about educating yourself and making choices. I know this is one thing I've had lots of discussions about with several friends, that the emotional attachment that a lot of us have to the beautiful plants that we are used to in our yards. And I'm not asking people to give up that emotional attachment and to abandon all those plants, but I am encouraging that we get a better balance going. We really can, especially if enough of us did it 1 yard at a time, we could make a difference. We could change our neighborhoods, and we could stop these declining numbers that are happening and reverse that trend. Doug Tallamy calls it, it's his new book that he wrote, he called it Nature's Best Hope. And what he's referring to is us humans deciding to landscape with native plants. That is our best hope for the fact that we have messed up and degraded natural settings, and we have been participating in all these declining numbers. We can participate in increasing the numbers and reversing this trend. Now, one thing I didn't mention, and I'm only going to say this one thing about it, I think we have an election coming up, and this is a good time to pay attention to our politicians and support the ones that are interested in the environment and care about healthy environments. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So now, if people want to ask questions, how do we do this, Lolly?
Lisa, I have a series of questions. I'll start from the top.
Okay.
I have at least 7 questions throughout the talk. Here's the first question. Why do deep-rooted plants sequester more carbon than shallow? That's from Allison.
Yes. Well, gosh, I wish I was a scientist and I could explain it better. You know, I'm not. That is not my forte to explain that. It's simply that carbon, and I don't think I'll do it justice. So I really don't, but I did do enough research before I put that slide in there and made that statement. I apologize for not being the one that needs to answer that in a better way. But I do think, I mean, there may be someone that's listening today that could do it justice, answer that question.
Anybody?
Carbon is sequestered in the soil, and it is the roots are part of what make that happen. I mean, there's a whole ecology of life going on under the surface of the soil, and the roots have everything to do with whether or not the carbon gets sequestered. So it only stands to reason that if there are deeper roots and more roots, then that will be beneficial. And again, I apologize. I feel like scientifically that's pretty weak. It's simple. That is as good as I can do for, you know, not being a scientist.
Moving to the next question, Gladys asked, and you've given this since the question was asked, or given some of it. So Gladys asked, what are some good host plants?
Yeah, well, trees are huge. Again, I'm working with a group to try to get some of the municipalities, we're starting with Fayetteville, to recommend on their tree list only native trees because it is such a missed opportunity. I tell people all the time, if you do one thing, plant a oak tree in your yard. Host plants, there are many host plants. Almost all the trees are host plants. They host almost everything. No, I'm sorry, that did not come out right at all. They host so many different things that they are a host plant. But as far as the herbaceous perennials, and that's what most people want to know about when they're talking about planting for the pollinators. Let me look up this spot you can go to. Oh, here it is, because I did save this in case there is a place you can go. This is my sources to, this would be a good place, and put that in the search and question. And because Gladys, what you want to do is ask the question for the Ozark region. You want to be sure you're asking about your region. And also, that's one of the main things I do is just give lists to people constantly of, let me see, I can tell you some by looking at my own well-behaved natives list because, okay. Joe Pye weed, which is blooming right now, is a host plant for 29 different kinds of butterflies and moths. Monardas are a host plant. Let's see, of course, the rudbeckias. The thing is, because most native plants have a specialized relationship, they host something. But if you are into bringing in more pollinators and butterflies and birds, then you go for the things like the purple coneflower, the rudbeckias, the list is so long, I just get boggled. Mountain mints, though. And so, Gladys, when you get time, and everybody else, I think you browse through the well-behaved natives list, and there are some numbers listed on that list that tell you how many butterflies and moths that plant supports.
Lisa, there was an additional piece of information from Jane, though I know that's not the name, that's the name that shows up, about sequestering carbon. Since all tissue is carbon-based, the more plant tissue there is, the more carbon that could be sequestered.
Okay, see, I knew somebody with a science brain would be able to answer that just simply and in a way that makes sense. Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Much better than I did.
The next question was Gladys, kind of a confirmation. So then our nectar feeders for hummingbirds are kind of like ice cream rather than dinner?
Absolutely. And, I love hummingbirds. I used to feed a gallon a day. But there's nothing wrong with that, actually, especially when they're migrating. But just understand that 30% is of that juice, and they can't raise babies on it at all. So that's just an interesting tidbit to know. And the same with feeding baby birds. I think people think it just never occurred to them that they can't cram that sunflower seed down that baby bird throat. And they can't. It has to be soft tissue, high protein, high quality. And that usually 90% of what is fed to baby birds, songbirds, is caterpillars. So that's one reason butterflies and moths are so important. It is all connected, as we all know.
Next question. What are some good suggestions for organic pesticides?
Well, as far as that white cabbage moth, BT, is very specific. Now, about pesticides, I encourage people, first of all, do the research and make sure you know what bug you are trying to get rid of and targeting. BT is an organic remedy that only targets caterpillars. You know, but if you're trying to grow cabbage or broccoli or any of that family, then you need to dust it with this dust called BT. There's a company in Fayetteville called, it used to be Nitron. Can anybody help me with the new name? Something in, I can't remember the new name. It's in Johnson near the railroad tracks, and they only sell organic remedies. They are my favorite across the board generalized, if I'm going to use it, is neem. Neem oil is organic. It doesn't really necessarily kill every bug. It's also a fungicide. It's from the neem tree. It's oil, which is a neem tree is not native to this country, but it is considered an organic remedy. So soapy water is a good one. It depends on the bug you're targeting, how you need to get rid of it. You know, when we were in the greenhouses at the botanical gardens, we ordered millions of ladybugs. So there are many, many things out there about how to garden organically. And it depends on what's being eaten. Now, one thing to note is that, and the best example is the monarch. When you watch a monarch eat the milkweed, it often defoliates that milkweed. But if you watch it after it's been defoliated and it is totally leafless, in 2 weeks those leaves grow back. When native plants get defoliated by their specialized, the insects and critters they have a specialized relationship with, it does not kill them. And so, I mean, there was one year where we had this giant oak tree and I was just certain that it was going to be dead the next year, and it wasn't. It was just a particular year where enough of a certain insect showed up that we could see the defoliation. Most of the time you don't notice the defoliation on an oak tree or a cherry tree. If you look close, you're going to notice the bug holes. We need to see that as a plus instead of a minus. But, and again, Japanese beetles are a different category. They, I don't like them. They are a bad bug. There's good bugs and bad bugs. And when you talk to entomologists, the majority of the bugs are beneficial. Only a small percentage of the bugs are not beneficial.
Lisa, Barb asked that question about organic pesticides, and she asked another one. Would a combo of shredded and whole leaves work for mulch?
Yes, it works, but my question is, why do you want to shred those leaves in the first place? Maybe that's how, instead of raking, that might be how you get them off of your yard, out of your yard. Just know that when those leaves fall, there are many, many insects that fall with the leaves. And so when you chew them up, it will work for mulch. Yes, it's excellent mulch. Or when you just bag them, rake them up and bag them up and send them to the compost, you are interfering with the life cycle of many of the insects that are in decline. So if you can figure out ways, I use whole leaves for mulch in my butterfly garden. When I used to have a vegetable garden, I used whole leaves, and it works just fine. The other thing I would use for a vegetable garden is straw that you go to, you know, like one of those Tractor Supply type stores and buy bales of straw. But if you're going to, you know, I would just encourage you to try to chew up as few leaves as possible.
Lisa, the next question was from Gladys. Could trees and plants be moving north and the insects following them because of climate change?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. What's happening with climate change, however, is that it's changing faster than the insects can adapt. It is true, and that is being studied all in every university that has an entomology department. All over the country, we are seeing that climate change is happening faster than the insects can adapt. Now, Doug because he's an entomologist, can explain the why behind that somewhat. I cannot, but I get it, that it just takes longer for the insects to adapt. It takes many, many life cycles before natural selection makes them be able to change. One of the things that we've seen happen, which is unfortunate, is because it gets warmer earlier in the season, the flowers are blooming earlier. And part of what this specialized relationship is that the insects and the flowers have learned to evolve and be active at the same time. So if the flower blooms too early before the insect needs it, and then it begins to decline, the nectar is not there for that insect. And so they are getting out of sync. And not every insect is this happening to, but this is happening a lot. And it is part of the reason we're seeing insect decline. Now, here's something, speaking of insect decline, one of the things that I had people ask me at some of these conversations is, what difference does it make? I don't like bugs. Well, you know, 20 years ago, the only good bug was a dead bug. And every yard was, if you saw a hole in any leaf, you sprayed for it. You sprayed chemicals for it. Well, I think our consciousness is beginning to change. We cannot continue these things and bugs are good. Humans are at the top of that food web. And I do not like apocalyptic conversation. I kind of refuse to go there. What I want to talk about is the changes we need to make so that we can have a healthy ecosystem. So I think I got distracted on that question and answer there, but anyway.
I'll move you on to the next question, Lissa, if you'd like.
Okay.
There will be, but there's Allison is mentioning, will there be a recording? And Gladys had said there will be a recording. Gladys, can you answer that before Allison leaves?
Yes, there will be a recording, and I will be sending a copy of it. There's some feedback. Melancy, you're unmuted again. Could you mute? I'll be sending it to Lissa, and she can send it out to anybody who asks her, or you can, if you leave your email in the chat, we can send it to you. It will eventually be posted on a YouTube channel that we'll be putting up, but for right now, I'm just going to release it to people who say that they want it.
Thank you.
And
Lissa, your next.
Just remember that if you are interested in being part of the Climate Change Forum listserv, please put your email into the chat also. A couple people have done that, and just wanted to remind people who may have come in later.
I didn't hear all of that. Did you ask me to put my email in the chat? You've got it, Gladys, already. Do you need my email? No.
Well, some of the people you know, and I don't necessarily have emails for some of the people. But if people who leave their email, anybody who leaves their email, I can send it to.
Okay. I will leave my email. I want you to send it to me.
The next question, Lissa, is Barb walks a golf course and she notices that the native plants are not eaten. Is that because of the pesticides?
That's possible. If you pay money to that golf course, I hope you go up there and tell them you would like them to stop spraying for insects. Again, the botanical garden is not chewed to nothingness. It's a beautiful space. And the more diversity you have, the more good insects you will draw in, and there will be a balance. Now, every now and then something gets decimated, but the more we express ourselves, the more we go to garden centers and ask for native plants that are not being sold, the more you tell people, if I don't know about your golf club, but are people members? You pay a membership, you get to say you're spending your money there. You get to ask that question and say, I wish you'd quit spraying pesticides. And you know, I'm not asking people to be bulldogs. I like people to be nice, but I do think you can express yourself, and the more we do that, the more we can turn the tide. And that's what we need to do. We're not there yet. We're a long ways from it. All you have to do is drive through neighborhoods and towns, and there are very few native plants in neighborhood after neighborhood. And the reason Arkansas is in decent shape is because the oak trees and the hickory trees and many of the maples just got left. And so if it were not for those trees, we would be in much worse shape ecologically than we are. It's the native trees that people did not cut down when they developed those neighborhoods. And when you go to the neighborhoods that have no native trees, it's an ecological desert. The bugs can't find anything to eat.
Shelley added that golf course pesticides kill pets and give cancer. The next question was not a question. Jane also said she had a list of Lissa's well-behaved plants, and she can send that out.
Or
Shelley
they can,
asked,
yeah.
go ahead.
Or
Pardon me,
they
Lisa,
can
go
go to
ahead.
the botanical gardens. Everybody can go there and download it or print it out. The botanical gardens, even though I don't still work there, they value that and they want it out too. I'm also working on a new list. I have not finished it. And I encourage you, if you get this list at least once a year, like January, go down, download it again, because I promise you it'll be upgraded or updated, and I'm constantly learning things and adding things. But the new list is native plants for shade. I have lots of people who have lots of shade, including me, and we want some native color in the shade. And so I'm working on that list, and I hope the botanical gardens will. I'm pretty sure they're going to let me put it on their website.
Great. Next question was from Shelley, asking if you have any advice about the high allergy plants. She's been sneezing all morning.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Shelley. I do not, allergies are such a plague. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's part of what we're going to have to do to share the planet. I'm sorry. I don't have any answers for allergies. And everybody's different. Early in the year, there are people that their only thing they're allergic to is the cedar pollen, which shows up about February, which is an odd thing because there are no flowers blooming, but I know people who just get incapacitated by the pollen on the cedar trees. So I don't.
Next question is from Arlene. She lives in California. She said, in essence, how can we get your best practices incorporated into city government landscaping, since they have so much land at their disposition?
Well, that is one thing I'm kind of working on. I mean, in order to get the city governments to pay attention to you, you have to have some credibility. Those of you who are inclined, if you can join things, that would be good. One of the things I'm on is the Arkansas Native Plant Society Education Committee. And that's where we're writing that, trying to hopefully suggest, we're going to suggest, again, I'm not a fan of the bulldog tactic, but we have a nice long list of suggestions that we hope they incorporate that are native trees. And so you have to get involved locally. I mean, I have been a backwoods person for 40 years now, and here I am in my retirement getting involved in local politics. But it's part of what we have to do, because they're not just going to listen too much. I do think Go online and see if you can find organizations and groups in your locality that is doing things. There are regulations in almost every municipality. Whether or not it is environmentally friendly or not is yet to be seen. But we are seeing slowly but surely changes in municipality regulations. I just think we need to go a little faster because climate change is.
There were two comments that go along with your questions. Allergy question, Jack says, as long as the plant is insect pollinated, it should not cause an allergy problem. And to go along with city government, Gladys says the city of Fayetteville just posted an opening on their environmental commission. And then the next question, moving along to the next question, Barb asked, the native perennials, can they be transplanted and when?
Okay. Let me write that down. Environmental Commission. Okay. All right. The better time to transplant almost anything, native or non, is fall. Though in general, that's a very general question. I would say transplant perennials in the fall and trees when they're dormant, or large shrubs would be the same. You could transplant them. Now, usually by, as soon as things start going dormant, you can transplant, but not August, not September. We're not dormant yet. This is a Northwest Arkansas question. Is that who asked that question?
About transplanting natives, it was Barb.
Oh, yeah, I know where Barb lives. Okay, I think it's the same Barb. Perennials in the fall, trees and large shrubs, I would say when they're dormant, which means, December and January, maybe early February. But don't let them break dormancy. Try to get them in the ground.
Lissa, Jack says this was an excellent presentation, and he also advises everyone to go to bfaudubon@gmail.com. Audubon has a bird-friendly yard program.
Yeah, I did. I left off Audubon, but I agree completely. I just couldn't fit it all on one page.
Yeah. Then a response about Nitron, and I'm not sure, I think the person has left already the presentation, but they said that their website or their email is gardeniq.com.
That's their new name. That is
gardeniq.com.
And they are incredibly helpful for organic gardening. Yeah.
Let's see. I've gotten several emails to give us their addresses. And let me see, I've got some new questions. Barb says, thank you, Lissa. Always learn more from you. Jane says, Lissa is the best and we always learn something new. And Jane says, some natives may be hard to transplant due to their deep roots, but I think some can be propagated by cuttings.
Oh, wait, yeah, let me talk a little bit more about that deep root thing. Thank you, Jane, for mentioning that. I totally agree. Many of the native plants that have deep roots do not transplant easily. And a great example is the orange or the butterfly milkweed. So I would encourage you to type in a Google question, is such and such easy to transplant, or does milkweed have a deep taproot, and see what you find before you try digging it up, because you could kill it by trying to transplant something with a deep taproot. In a lot of the writings about native plants, that will be mentioned, whether or not it has a deep taproot. And many of the native plants have deep taproots. So I gave the wrong impression. If it's transplantable and does not have a deep taproot, you could do it in the fall. But I would not try to, and the smaller the plant is, the better for transplanting.
Here's another question from Carla. Lissa, your native plant consultation, is that for large projects or for individuals?
It's for both. The biggest thing for me is time limits. And I don't live in Fayetteville. Oh, so I only do it now in Fayetteville and Springdale. I've had to draw back and bring it in so that I'm not driving an hour to talk to people and then an hour back. And I actually live in Madison County, so I'm having to limit it a little. I'm sorry. But I will, I will answer lots of questions, email, and direct people if I can. My email is on that well-behaved natives list.
One other comment from Jane. She says the goldfinches are all over her sunflowers,
Yeah.
and she looks at the holes in the leaves of plants as badges of courage.
Yeah, I love that. Yes, it's true. It is good. I may quote Jane, whoever Jane is. I'm not sure if I know her or not.
At the
Badges
beginning of the comments, she gave her name, and it's not Jane, and I don't have it written down.
Okay.
Does anybody have another question? You know, we all thank you, Lissa. It was wonderful.
Thank you. And I want to say that it took courage for me to do my first, virtual video thing, and it wasn't bad at all. And part of it was that all of you guys are so friendly. You're my age. You're good folks. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Lissa.
So you're going to tell me what to do.
Okay, so I think we're ready to close down, and maybe everybody who has their video on could say, give her a wave as a thank you. And
Hugs, hugs.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
And,
very much.
Shelley
Lisa, thank
or
you so
Lolly,
much.
can you
This
tell
has been so wonderful.
us what the next climate change forum is going to be for September? Unmute yourself, Lolly.
The next climate change program, first Sunday in September, virtual, is Hannah Evans from Population Connection. Go to omnicenter.org for the details.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Really do appreciate you. Okay, I'm gonna say goodbye and close us down now. Thank you.